entirely intentional. Um, I don't think the Vikings ever cooked dishes like this. I'm pretty sure they didn't. But this is what the Carolingian nobility knew, and I think some of it would have filtered north. So let's talk a little bit about the Carolingian Empire and how it influenced the Vikings. First of all, it was big, rich, and inviting. The Carolingian Empire was, for much of the Viking Age, the big power that they dealt with, the one large state on their doorstep, and for a given value of this modern state on their doorstep. They knew bigger, richer states, of course. There were trade contacts all the way to Constantinople, all the way to Baghdad. They knew that there were other places, but these were far away. The Carolingian Empire shared a border with Denmark. It was close by. And the Carolingian Empire was trying extremely hard to be a state just like the Byzantine Empire, just like the Caliphate of Baghdad, just like the Emirate of Cordoba. It was failing, but it was trying. It really meant to be that, which gave it something that would have been interesting to people from northern kingdoms who were used to something politically very different. But let's start with just how Carolingian influence could have been mediated. The first and simplest thing was that the Carolingian border was coming closer and closer until the empire shared a border with the Kingdom of Denmark. You can still see where this border ran. It's the Danevirke, the Danework. This was a defensive wall, and if everything you've heard about the Vikings probably convince you that the Carolingians would be perfectly justified to build a wall to keep out the Danes. In fact, the Danework was built by the Danish king to keep out the Carolingians. And it has been argued, I think not entirely convincingly, but with some degree of conviction, that the first raids on the Frankish coasts were actually in retaliation against Carolingian attacks on Denmark. And that the whole Viking Age, some people say, was started like that. I don't quite see it, but certainly it must have played a role, because the Carolingians were an aggressive expansionist power when they first met the Danes. The border was never closed or even particularly impermeable. There was a lot of trade across the Danish border, but it was always also militarized. There was always also warfare between the Danish kings, the various Danish kings, and the Carolingian emperors. At one point, a Danish pretender was actually supported in his attempt to overthrow his rival by Charlemagne. They were very much involved in politics in the north. Number two, there was the seaborne trade, especially through Frisia, through the Emporium of Dorestad and other places. The Frisians were the North Sea traders of their time before the Danes and the Norwegians really went into this business. And Frisia was part of the Carolingian Empire. At this point, had been for a good century. Then, of course, there was the imperial court. Like I said, Harald Clark, a Danish pretender, played a significant role in the political plans of Charlemagne for Christianizing and effectively vassalizing Denmark. It didn't work, but it was tried. They took an interest and they had contact with the upper classes, with the kings and rulers, well, kings for given value of kings, of the north. Christianization came later. Christianization in the Scandinavian north was entirely mediated through the Church of the Carolingian Empire. The background to this is that the Catholic Church as we know it today, and the papacy as we know it today, is a product of the Carolingian Empire. I don't want to go too much into detail with this, but when the various kings of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden embraced Christianity, they did it mediated through bishoprics and through monastic systems that were completely Carolingian, that were built in Germany and France, as we know today, inside the empire. And they did it not least because of that, because the Carolingian church was a church for emperors and kings and rulers, a church that gave them a central position. That mattered. And finally, the Carolingian Empire was a source of status goods. You could get nice, shiny things there. Whether you got them through trade or through raiding or through vassalization didn't particularly matter. A lot of the Carolingian economy was based on pretty much the same things that the later Viking Age economy was based. Slave trading, raiding, the giving of status goods to military retainers. This thing here, by the way, that you're seeing here, is a trefoil brooch. That's a particularly nice example of this. Trefoil brooches show up in the 9th century in Scandinavian contexts, and they become very, very popular piece of women's attire. This particular piece is Scandinavian made. The first trefoil brooches that show up in Scandinavian women's graves are all of Carolingian origin, and they are always found, as far as I can tell, in women's graves. Now, you all know that identifying women's graves by grave goods sort of is a circular logic, but by and large, it seems to bear out. Now, these things in Carolingian contexts are part of a sword belt. So apparently the Vikings liked them enough to bring them home, but at the same time decided that this stuff was more fitting for women. And I think that may have been a bit of a macho commentary on the military prowess of the Carolingians, because they weren't that impressed. So this is the Carolingian Empire's influence. It was probably pretty massive. So how do we know what the Carolingian Empire was like, especially with regard to food? Well, we have a wide variety of sources that we can go to. I did a complete anachronist on one. It came out in 2012. It's number 156. So if you are really interested in the topic, you could start with that one. Archaeology is really interesting. Unfortunately, much of the archaeological work is done in Northern Europe, which gives us the idea that the Carolingian Empire was something that happened mostly in the Rhineland, in central Germany, in northern France, in the Netherlands. The actual economic and cultural core of the Carolingian Empire was probably more southern France, northern Italy. But there isn't a lot of archaeological work done there at the moment, simply because people there have a wealth of Roman, Greco-Roman and Gallic remains that they like to dig. So I really look forward to more data coming out of the Mediterranean countries for comparison. The archaeology of Northern Europe gives us interesting pictures of life in Carolingian world, and it shows a great deal of similarities to what we find later in Scandinavia. There isn't a clear cultural dividing line for most purposes. The second thing, and this is something that the Carolingian Empire can give us that we don't get that early in the North, is literary sources. The Carolingian world is one that is inordinately focused on literature in its upper classes. We don't know how many people could read. It's probably not a good assumption to think that very few people did. We went through a long period of basically assuming the Carolingian Empire was very primitive. Neither the sources nor the archaeological finds bear this out. It was a world where written documents had their place, where people sent letters, where there were trade connections, where there were markets and fairs and things like that. The main problem with our literary sources is that Carolingian writers thought of themselves as Roman. They had access to Latin texts. They were just trying to codify the idea that Latin was a separate language, and succeeding brilliantly, creating a canon of what classical Latin was like. And they loved to copy Romans, which means that whenever you read Carolingian literary source, you need to look at what did the Romans write on this topic, and where are these people just copying? This is very, very difficult, but if you sift through them properly, you can get there. Administrative sources. This is a wonderful thing. The Carolingian Empire actually wrote down stuff. They wrote down loads of stuff, and some of it survives. There are law texts, capitularies, which is letters basically that the king or emperor wrote with his decrees, with his instructions. There are church records, and there are the so-called triptychs or estate lists. These are lists of what a given estate, that is a given land holding, was supposed to produce in taxes, and sometimes even what it held, what was found there on inspection. There's several of those that survive. We'll look at some of them. And finally, the Carolingian world has left us some recipe collections. The problem with that is, talked about the Romans, they are Roman in origin. We actually don't know whether they used them or whether they just copied them out of antiquarian interest. But the reason that we have the Roman cookbook of Apicius was that it was written down in copies for Carolingian emperors. Carolingian emperors obviously cared enough to have this text produced in a beautiful manuscript form. No older copy survives. We wouldn't have it if it wasn't for the fact that the Carolingian dynasty cared. So, what we don't have is any particularly good image of what the average Carolingian ate. It's all speculative. This is something I made for this Carolingian feast, basically the lower class food: bacon, beans, bread, onions. I called it the fuel of an empire. And this is probably what the average Carolingian diet would have looked like. The beans are especially interesting because we don't have good evidence for legumes, for beans and peas of any kind up north before that time. But around the Carolingian time, we find a settlement at Elisenhof. You've heard about it before. The settlement at Elisenhof is not in the Carolingian Empire. It's just across the border in Denmark. Today it's northern Germany. And it was probably a place that made, it's an agricultural settlement, but it probably economically survived by catering to the needs of traders, because it's on the opposite side of the Jutland Peninsula from Haithabu. So it's where ships heading from the North Sea into Haithabu would have passed. And Elisenhof is a place where beans played an enormous role. We can see this from the pollen and from the agricultural residue that they ate beans. Some of the excavators estimated that 50% of their calories of the inhabitants came from beans, broad beans, of course. Beans have a lot of protein, and some interesting things have been said about legumes, especially about beans and longevity, and especially female longevity in the Middle Ages. It's entirely possible that this was something that came from the Carolingians to the north, but I don't know enough about the Viking Age to be able to be sure about this. And we know the Carolingians ate lots of beans. Rabanus Maurus, who was a Carolingian writer on just about anything, one of those intellectuals of multiple interests who set out to write a book that he simply called Of the Universe, De Universo, in which he describes pretty much all things. And he dedicates a chapter to foods, and in it he mentions beans and peas, a long list of legumes, which he says are for humble people. So what culinary influence could there have been, and how does it travel? The problem is that culinary culture is very strongly tied to local conditions. Food doesn't usually travel very well before the modern era. You can not really grow the Carolingian crop package in central Norway or even southern Finland very well. So if things traveled, very likely what traveled first was upper class food, and very likely what traveled first were specific things, specific techniques. Getting a clear picture here is difficult. I've been looking at archaeology. There's some things that I'm pretty sure traveled north early, even well before the Carolingian times. There are some things I think were specifically mediated through the Carolingian Empire. There are some things I'm just not longer sure about. This thing here, this is obviously a replica. This is not the original thing, but this is an example for how foodways did travel and how we can trace them, because this is pottery. The wonderful thing about pottery is it does not get destroyed. This is what we call a Tartinger Kanne, Tartingware. Tartingware is a specific kind of pottery that originates from somewhere in the Rhine Valley. We're not entirely sure, in the Carolingian Empire. It's a nice wheel-thrown bit of pottery, and it has tin foil, actual beaten tin stuck to it in a decorative pattern. And these were used for serving wine, and we find them all across the Viking world in high status contexts. We find them in the grave field at Haithabu, we find them in Birka, we find them in a couple of places in Gotland. These were apparently popular, and I will assume that not only the dishes, but also the wine that was carried, what was served in them, would have traveled. I'm pretty sure that wine was one of the most important articles of upper class foodways that traveled north. Cultural contact, as I wrote here, is often class specific. And while it was not only the upper classes that visited the Carolingian Empire, I think it was specifically the upper classes that would have been impressed with it. Because your average Carolingian peasant probably didn't have a very different quality of life to your average Gotlandish or Norwegian or Danish farmer. If anything, he might have been poorer. But your average Carolingian nobleman probably lived a much richer, much more varied, much more stimulating life than your average Gotlandish Jarl. And very likely the upper class were the first to take an interest. Now, here we have the Carolingian Empire as it grew to its largest extent under Charlemagne. This is what it looked like. You can probably imagine right away why is there, sorry. Imagine right away that this is not a place that is unified. You've got roughly this line dividing beer country from wine country at the time. You've got areas where wheat grows very well and areas where wheat does not grow very well at all. And you've got areas where you have real urban civilization surviving. Here in the Lombard Kingdom, for example, Milan is a place that has functioning bathhouses, that has paved streets, that has functioning aqueducts, versus up here, Saxony, which is a recent conquest, where life is really very, very similar to what it was like in contemporary Denmark.
Volker, there's a question in the chat about what is the
Yes.
Carolingian food package?
Bread. Bread, basically beans and preserved meat. The thing is that bread is very important in the Carolingian diet. We don't know whether everybody ate it. It's not entirely likely, but bread matters in the Carolingian world more the further south you go. And that is not a matter of course. In many other parts of contemporary Northern Europe, it's porridge, not bread, that is that important. Then it's preserved meats. The Carolingian Empire is a village economy. The medieval village system is emerging at this point. So this is a place where grain growing, collective grain growing, and cattle raising, livestock raising is important. We have an interesting set of excavations from the Veluwe region in, here it's called Frisia, today it's the Netherlands, where the archaeologists unearthed bones and tried to reconstruct slaughter patterns. And they came up with the assumption, with the reconstruction, that most families would have slaughtered 2 or 3 larger animals a year, and almost all the muscle meat would have been preserved and only the organ meat eaten immediately. They even reconstructed the soup that was made from the skull of a slaughtered pig, which is roughly similar to the kind of soup that is still made in the area, by how the bones were split open to get at the marrow. Beans are very important across the Carolingian Empire. We know this both from written sources and from archaeology. Beans and peas and other legumes. So this is basically the Carolingian crop package. In terms of what grains, rye is playing an increasing role. The Carolingian age sees the rise of rye cultivation across much of the empire. Wheat still has the highest status. Spelt is important. Oats are there. They are growing in importance. What we don't know is whether they were used as animal feed or whether they were eaten by people. Barley is declining in importance, but it's all farmed in increasingly in collective fields. So the medieval village economy, which its attendant grain-heavy, lighter on-meat cuisine, is Carolingian. Does that answer the question?
Yes, she says thank you.
All right. So going on, the core territories of the Carolingian Empire are these: Austrasia and Neustria, the area around Paris, the Ile-de-France, the Upper Rhine Valley, the Central Rhine Valley, and Aquitaine and Burgundy, southern France. And then down here you have the Lombard Kingdom, which was added under Charlemagne. The Lombard Kingdom is hugely important culturally. I don't think we can ever underestimate it. And it is such a pity that so little archaeological work has been done there until very recently. And much of the public material is very difficult to get hold of because it's in Italian and rarely available through easy interlibrary loans. But there's absolutely fascinating stuff happening down there. The conquests of Charlemagne drive the border north. So as you can see here, you've got Bavaria and Carinthia added to the empire. You've got Saxony added to the empire. 797 is the final conquest. 810, he's pushing the Danish border all the way to right here is Haithabu, to right there. And he's got his cordon of allies, of vassal kings, vassal tribes, the Obotrides, the Veleti, the Sorbs, the Czechs and Moravians, the Avars, which he conquers. The way that this area is controlled is very, very controversial, but there's definitely strong Carolingian influence. And he had the same thing in mind for Denmark. It didn't work, but he tried. This is the height of the Carolingian Empire. After that, while the territorial extent doesn't change much, the political power does. There is no longer a unified empire. There are various kings and people claiming the imperial crown with various degrees of success. It is no longer politically that powerful, and in fact it becomes a very popular destination for raids by the Vikings. But culturally, it is still a very close by, very interesting place. Right, sorry, I need to remove those crosses. All right, now, Another thing that we know something about is what Carolingian kitchens looked like. We don't have anywhere near as good an archaeological image as we do for the Merovingian period or the Roman period, because the Carolingians didn't give anybody grave goods, which is embarrassing. Sometimes we have to use Scandinavian archaeological sources to reconstruct what Carolingian gear looked like, because the Carolingians didn't bury it with people, but the Scandinavians did. But we have a couple of estate lists, and one of those triptychs or estate lists gives us an idea of what would be found in the kitchen of a royal estate. Asnapium, that is modern Annap in France, was a small estate, but one large and significant enough so that it was assumed a traveling king could visit there realistically. The estate list provides 2 bronze basins and cups, 1 iron kettle, 2 bronze kettles, a frying pan, and irons, and a chain. That is not a particularly grand establishment, but it is the kind of thing that you would have to be wealthy to afford. Of course, this doesn't list everything. Pottery vessels are not listed, wooden vessels are not listed, furniture is not listed. This list only captures things that have inherent value, basically metal tools. From the archaeological records, we know that pottery cookpots were the most common thing. Round-bottomed, unadorned pottery cookpots were the standard items of the kitchen. Metal implements were expensive. Wooden equipment was very likely of high standard. Again, our problem is paucity of finds. The Carolingians don't do grave goods, but we do know that they admired the craft of the wood turner, because a poem from the Carolingian era describes it. And we know that before and after, wooden furniture and wooden kitchenware of high quality was produced, because we know it from finds in Scandinavia. So again, we are assuming that the Carolingians did this. We know that the Vikings did it. We know that the predecessors to the Carolingians did it, because the grave finds at Oberflacht that are just pre-Carolingian also survive. But again, Carolingians don't bury stuff with their dead. So please, if you have future archaeologists, please consider getting buried with some stuff. This is what these cookpots would have looked like, these Carolingian cookpots, Bardorf ware. These are not unusual at all, and you find them similarly shaped pots all over the north, including Viking settlements, including Haithabu, including Birka. This is specifically Bardorf ware, which is from the Rhineland. There are a couple of other places of origin. Interestingly, Bardorf ware, which is a utilitarian kind of pottery, does show up across the north, in Haithabu, in Birka, in Karlsbad. Again, presumably because of trade contacts. We don't know what was traded in these. I don't think they were sold as cookpots. I somehow can't quite see an early medieval Tupperware representative, but they were traded. They were carried in ships all the way to Scandinavia. And these are not high status goods, so presumably what was in them would have mattered. Wine and beer. This, I think, is where you get the first and the most lasting influence, drinking, because Carolingian hospitality culture, as well as, as Viking hospitality culture, is all about getting red-arsed. Alcoholic beverages are central. There is an interesting thesis, which I think is completely right, that while hospitality in the high and late Middle Ages and in Roman times focuses on food, focuses on the good food that you can serve your guests, and therefore produces a kind of upper class gourmet cuisine that prizes exotic ingredients and prizes rare flavors. Hospitality culture in the early Middle Ages focuses on drink, and therefore foods are not that centrally important, but drinks, alcoholic drinks are. We know that wine was highly prized, partly because of the Roman tradition. Romans did not drink beer, they looked down on it, and Carolingian intellectuals and the Carolingian upper class loved all things Roman. Because of Christian belief, Christ never said, take this beer and drink it in my memory. And wine was present in the Carolingian Empire all the way to the Rhine Valley. And we know it was exported in large quantities because casks from the Rhine Valley that presumably held wine are again found in much of Scandinavia. Also exported was glassware and serving gear for wine drinking. So there's a special kind of slotted spoon that was used for serving wine. There are glasses, tumblers, and Ruton-style glasses that were made in the Carolingian Empire and are found all over Scandinavia. It is very, very likely that wealthy Scandinavians took a liking to wine very early, and that this was an important trade connection with the Carolingian Empire, because you can't loot wine very effectively. Gold and silver and people are relatively easy to steal, but casks of wine are not convenient loot. You can't put very many of them on a warship, and they're very hard to transport, but you can put them on trade ships and they make a very good export. Beer, on the other hand, was mostly brewed locally and used quickly. And we know that brewing was an important business in every royal estate and in every monastic establishment, just as it was across Scandinavia. This is an example of Carolingian wine drinking. This is the slotted spoon. Just a moment. Right. This thing here is the slotted spoon we find. Sorry about this. I need to, nope. Sorry about this. Something went funny just now. I dislike these. Okay, try it again. Right, this is I'm not going to click on anything now. This is the slotted spoon, and these are the tumbler beakers. These things are deliberately designed to show status because you can't actually put them down. The only way that these beakers can stand is on their mouth. So you either have to drink them up completely, or, as in this case, you have to have a servant who's holding this for you the whole time, just in case you need to, you wish to take a drink. This is a depiction of luxuria. It's the incarnation of luxury. So obviously this is an extreme case, but this stuff, these beakers, they show up in Scandinavian finds. Then grain and bread. Wheat enjoyed the highest status, rye and oats became more common, and bread became a common food. I said here at least for the rich. I should have said at least for the non-poor, because when you say rich in the Middle Ages, the idea is usually the king and like 5 other guys, but I think we need to revise that. There was a relatively large group of people who had disposable income and used it on small luxuries, and bread would have been one. We know from estate lists and from the Capitulare de Villis, which is a really interesting document, that the best bread was similum, and that it was not easy to produce. The Capitulare de Villis, which is a royal command of how royal estates should be run, requires bakers skilled at making this bread to be present on all royal estates. We don't actually know what this bread was like exactly. I've done some speculating on it, but I'm not really closer to any solution. But we know that it wasn't produced with any particularly complex equipment, because what we find are hand mills and simple ovens everywhere. Bread prices are also regulated by royal command and capitularies. So bread was a trade good. It was sold in markets, and the price was of concern to the king, which suggests that it mattered to people. There are some interesting finds at Elisenhof. I love this site. It's absolutely fascinating. That suggests that the people there ate their grain in the form of unleavened, dried flatbreads that are very, very similar to Knäcke. We don't know whether this was common in the Carolingian Empire or not, but we know that the equipment that they used to produce them was very similar. This is a simple bread oven. This one was reconstructed from finds at the site at Haithabu on the border between Denmark and the Carolingian Empire in the 9th century. But very similar ovens are found across the Carolingian Empire and across Scandinavia in the Viking Age. They are more common in the empire. It has been speculated that bread didn't play such a big role in Viking cuisine, but we know that across Scandinavia, these ovens do show up, and the hand mills that go with them do show up. So again, bread eating was not just an affectation. Bread eating was something people did. And just like in slightly later times, the high medieval combination of watermill or windmill, manorial, seigneurial mill, and the large thermal mass baking oven that produces leavened bread makes its showing first in the cities of Scandinavia and then moves into the countryside. It looks as though the combination of the hand mill, the quern, and the baking oven to produce Carolingian style bread also went this way through the upper classes, through the wealthier people. But this is still quite speculative. One thing that we know that the Carolingian upper class valued hugely was horticulture, fruit, vegetables, and herbs. It doesn't quite match the image of these Germanic warlords, but they loved gardens, they loved gardening, they left us huge amounts of documents, and it's not just the monks. You would think, and it has been suggested, it was suggested in the past, that this gardening was something monks did. The world outside was a screaming void of barbarism and savagery, and people were chopping each other's heads off, and the monks retreated behind the high walls and tended their little vegetable gardens. It's a beautiful romantic image, but we know that royal estates and seigneurial estates had well-managed fruit and vegetable gardens. We know this from the Capitulare de Villis, which is a really interesting document. If we have the time at the end, I'll look at it with you just briefly. We know it from the plan of the monastery at St. Gall and from a poem by Walafrid Strabo about the monastery garden at Reichenau. And if we compare these with estate lists, because we also have some estate lists that provide information on gardens, we get an idea of a culture that really liked herbs, vegetables, and fruit, and considered them high status. They also made fruit wines. They also made fruit. They also made preserved fruits, probably also dried fruits. We're not quite sure about this. And they put herbs into wine. We know that for sure due to a poem, through a poem that is always cited as the first example of Maibole, but isn't actually. But apparently in May, you would collect specific herbs from the garden and put them in wine and serve it like that. Carolingian culture is very rich with horticultural references. Another thing that the Carolingians had was spices. Now, this is one of the things where I don't think the conventional narrative holds. We have evidence for spice imports to the Carolingian Empire. The Hortulus, that is that poem by Walafrid Strabo, noticed that pepper is valued among the Gauls. With the Gauls, he presumably means the French or the Southern French. There are records in the monastery at Corbie in France, shows that they purchased pepper, cinnamon, galingale, cloves, and mastic. And a poem the Valtarius, there is also an English version of it, by the way, the Voltaire, speaks of a dish being bene pigmentata. Pigmenta is the word for spices, so it is well spiced. But the problem is, we love these records because they are fascinating and they get held up, but there's very, very little of it. We very little other archaeological or administrative record of spices, and everything we know about Carolingian cuisine suggests that spices didn't play a big role, herbs did. So I don't think that Scandinavia imported much spices in the way through the Carolingian route. I don't think spicing comes to Europe through the Carolingian Empire. I think the taste for spices in the Middle Ages comes in at a later time. But that's just, again, my speculation. Here's an interesting thing. We actually have what is almost a recipe from the Hortulus. This is for fried gourd, and of course I tried it. The description of the bottle gourd is that when it is harvested young, so it doesn't grow a woody shell, but is still edible, is still soft, it would be cut into slices and fried in the pan with a lot of fat. May the well-prepared pieces grace the dessert course, the word is secunda mensa, which is, of course, the Roman tradition of the things you eat to end the meal.
Volker, we have a question about spices in the chat room. Could it have been used for aromatics or incense, the use of spices?
That's possible. We don't know that. We know that there were some spices used in food, but we do not know what the majority of spices were used for. We have some law texts that require, basically it's regulations for what imperial messengers or royal messengers were due to be given when they stopped at noble or monastic estates. And these lists always include spices along with the foods. But these lists are copied from Merovingian lists, and these Merovingian lists presumably go back to late Roman examples. And since they very rarely actually put in the numbers, they survive from formularies, not from actual use, we don't know to what extent they would have been applicable. It's quite possible that very, very few people ever ate spices. I'm fairly convinced that Carolingians did not eat a lot of spicy food. Not even the upper classes, not because they couldn't have, but because they didn't particularly value it. So I tried this. It's actually very good. Just fried gourd. I sweetened it with a little honey, and I served it with salt. It was good in both kinds, but it was better with honey. It was excellent with honey and pepper, but I have zero evidence that that particular combination actually survived into the Carolingian era. Honey and pepper is a Roman thing. Right. Another thing that shows up every now and then is the idea that Christian influence drove change in eating habits. The fast days, the Eucharist, the examples of Christian literature. So the idea that bread is proper food for humans, that wine is the proper drink for people, that fish is eaten on specific days, that some people claim that fishing was brought in by Christians, by monks, that people didn't actually eat fish across all of Northern Europe until the Christians introduced them to the habit. There are some interesting sides to this, but it stands on wobbly feet in some places. An interesting example is horse flesh. Apparently in Scandinavia, horses were eaten readily, and the conversion, the records of the conversion of Iceland particularly are interesting in this regard, because people were given special dispensation for eating horses. In Carolingian times, a report by the missionary Boniface, Saint Boniface, the apostle of the Germans, they called him later, that people in Thuringia ate horses. resulted in a horrified response from Rome by the Pope telling him to make them stop doing that. There's no particular reason given, and we're still guessing as to why. But the papal bull had an influence that continues to this day, and horse flesh was banned across the Carolingian Empire as a food. This ban never quite worked all the way into Scandinavia, but it is one of the things that comes with Christianization, that people in Northern Europe stop eating horse. The fish thing is much more questionable, because the claim is that the fishing industry, the entire connex of keeping fish in ponds, of aquaculture, of fish, especially carp, of trading salt herring and trading stockfish, came in with the Christianization. But the first archaeological evidence for the carp as a species comes from West Slavic contexts in Carolingian times, which are absolutely clearly and unequivocally pagan. And the carp must have come in as a cultivated species, because there is no way it can swim from the lower Danube, where it is native, all the way to Poland. There is no connection. It must have been brought in. Herring salting very likely shows up for the first time archaeologically on a large scale in Haithabu. Haithabu is about as pagan as you can get. It is deliberately a settlement where the contact between West Slavic and Danish traders happens. And Haithabu is our first archaeological evidence for large-scale herring salting. So there is also evidence for stockfish in Dorestad, predating the Viking Age, which was brought in by traders from Scandinavia. So presumably was already produced to provision ships. I don't think that particular narrative holds water. I think the whole fishing complex of Northern Europe is a native development and only really grows to industrial proportions in the Christian Middle Ages, not because it's Christian, but because there's more people living there. What did matter, very likely, was the demand for wheat and wine. Wheat is needed for communion bread, wine is needed for communion. And we know from comparable documents that around the time of the Christianization of Ireland, Irish kings and chieftains were given gifts of wine and wheat from popes and bishops on the mainland, and very gratefully received those. Now, I don't think they were only for communion. I think they were used to convey status, and I think they serve much the same way in Scandinavia. Monastery gardens and medicine were also important in transmitting horticultural knowledge. And I think here it's actually true that the monastic influence would have been decisive, simply because monasteries are designed for the long run, and therefore building gardens and planting orchards is something that makes sense if you're building a monastery. Right. So getting back to this thing, by the way, this thing is a patina. It's a Roman-style dish made of eggs and milk, and it is made in this particular case with figs and olives, fried in olive oil. What you do is you mix eggs with flour and milk, you heat olive oil in a pan, then you put in the batter, and just as it hardens at the bottom, you put in olives, chopped olives and chopped figs, and you let it harden in the pan and serve it hot right out of it. This particular recipe, I regret to say, is not Carolingian, it's Merovingian. It shows up in the writings of Gregory of Tours. But it is described there, and I personally think that this kind of food would have been common in the southern reaches of the empire, and something that the Carolingian nobles of the north would have been familiar with, because Carolingian noblemen traveled a lot. The Carolingian Empire was strongly interconnected. Carolingian nobles, even from Saxony or Frisia, from the northern fringes of the empire, would have had personal experiences of places like the Emirate of Cordoba, northern Italy, even the Emilia Romagna, and encountered culture there, and eaten their foods and drank their wines and worn their clothing, and would have brought this experience up north. And that, I think, really is where the cultural role of the Carolingian Empire as the transmitter of upper class culture to the north, including culinary culture, matters. Right, I will invite questions.
Kunihild has her hand up.
Yes.
There we go. I first, thank you very much. That was an outstanding presentation. And I think I'm with you on the fish thing. Living in Alaska, preserved fish is a very standard winter staple. And it's incredibly hard for me to imagine that a coastal population would not have figured out fish preservation, especially winters in the north are not known for their surplus of food.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that that is a very likely explanation. And there is a there is a story from Anglo-Saxon England that monks would have had to come in and teach people to fish in a famine. I don't buy it. There was a question about the list of crops assembled for Charlemagne. There isn't one list, but just a moment. Okay, the things you want, no, not the Lex here. The thing you want is the Capitulare de Villis. Why is this in German? I want the English one. The Capitulare de Villis. That is a text on the management of royal estates. It's quite extensive and probably comes from, ascribing this to Charlemagne is slightly controversial. It is also sometimes assumed that, some people argue that it was dictated by his son. But even if it was, it very clearly gives you an idea of what Carolingian royal estates were supposed to be like. And it's, where is it here? Fish ponds, various grain crops, and so on. So this is one text you want to look at. Then the royal estates at Asnapium and Treola. As a description of the buildings, and then supplies of barley, oats, spelt wheat, peas, beans, and rye. And other estates, Reperiminus and Treola, also have these lists. And here we have the lists of the things that are found. This is in Asnapium, in Anaps. The things you find in the garden. You find agrimony, beets, botany, cabbage, calendula, catnip, celery, chervil, chives, clary, sage, coriander, costmary, garlic, kohlrabi, southernwood, wild mint, tansy, scallion, savory, sage, rue, parsley, onions, mallow, marshmallow, lovage, lily, leeks, apples, cherries, hazelnuts, juniper, medlars, mulberries, peaches, pears, plums, quinces, and walnuts. Obviously, you can grow this kind of variety in central France. It would not translate very well to northern Germany, let alone Norway. But this is an actual working document. This is one of the very rare instances where we don't have a formulary that shows you how it's supposed to be done, but an actual report that contains data. The Capitulare de Villis is an ideal. It is a much more extensive list. The Asnapium, the list at Anap, is probably a glimpse of reality. And there are a couple of other things. Link to the slides. Yes, please. There are a couple of other administrative documents. I've compiled a few of them in the Complete Anachronist. It's CA 156. Carolingian foodways. It's number 2 of 2012. I put the list together in there so you can find it, comparing the Capitolare de Villiers list, the Hortulus list, and the Plan of St. Gall list for garden layouts with some administrative documents that actually provide glimpses of reality. Any other questions? Oh, thank you.
Excellent, informative presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. I hope the recording isn't quite as bad as the picture I'm seeing, but I do apologize. My webcam is very, very bad.